In a mountainside resort in Switzerland, diplomats shook hands and called it history. The United States and Iran had just signed a memorandum ending months of open war, a document that promised, in its own words, the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon. Officials called it a turning point. Markets steadied. For a moment, it looked like the region was stepping back from the brink. Then, hours later, Israeli jets were over Beirut. Strikes hit the southern suburbs of the Lebanese capital the same night the ceasefire was supposed to take hold everywhere. Iran said this was a direct violation of the deal it had just signed. Israel said the deal never applied to Lebanon in the first place. And Washington, which had brokered the agreement, did not correct either version. It let both stand. That contradiction is not a footnote. It is the story. Because if Lebanon is inside the ceasefire, Israel is breaking it. And if Lebanon is outside the ceasefire, then Iran's signature on that document means far less than the world was told. Two allies, one ceasefire, two completely different definitions of what it actually covers, and a small country caught in the space between them. This is not simply a dispute over wording. It is a test of whether the United States can hold together a peace with Iran while its closest ally in the Middle East keeps fighting Iran's most important partner on the ground. What plays out in Lebanon over the coming months will not stay contained to Lebanon. It will decide which vision of order in the Middle East actually survives and which one was never real to begin with. To understand how we got here, start with the timeline on the ground. The current chapter of this conflict traces back to October 2023, when Hezbollah began firing into northern Israel in solidarity with Gaza. A ceasefire in 2024 was supposed to end it. It didn't hold. Then on February 28th of this year, Israel and the United States launched a direct war against Iran, killing Iran's supreme leader in the opening strike. Hezbollah responded by resuming rocket and drone attacks on Israel, and Israel answered with the largest campaign it has launched against Lebanon in decades. Since March 2026, Israeli ground forces have pushed deep into southern Lebanon and today occupy roughly 1/5 of the country. The human toll is severe. More than 4,000 people killed, over 1 million displaced from their homes. This is the scale most coverage settles on, and it's real. But it's only part of the picture. In parallel, Washington has been negotiating something separate: the trilateral framework, a direct arrangement between Israel and the Lebanese government. Under its terms, it is not Israel and not Hezbollah that disarms Hezbollah. It is the Lebanese armed forces working in stages, zone by zone, in exchange for a phased Israeli withdrawal. On paper, it hands Lebanon responsibility for its own sovereignty. Hezbollah has rejected the framework outright. The actors shaping this are worth naming clearly. On the American side, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has led negotiations for the Trump administration. On the Israeli side, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz have set the terms of engagement. Lebanon's President Joseph Aoun is trying to hold his government together under pressure from all directions. Hezbollah's leader Naim Qassem has drawn his own red lines, and Iran's negotiating team led by Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf is watching Lebanon as closely as anyone. 4 actors, 4 sets of interests. And here's what most coverage misses. This isn't one conflict. It's 3 overlapping agreements: the US-Iran MOU, the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire, and the trilateral framework, each interpreted differently by the very people who signed them. To understand why Hezbollah's weapons have become such an immovable red line, we have to go back further than this year's war. To understand why Hezbollah's weapons are treated as almost sacred, you have to go back to the 1980s. Hezbollah was founded during Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon with direct sponsorship from Iran as an armed resistance movement. It was never meant to be a conventional army. It was meant to be something Lebanon's own state couldn't easily control, and that was the point. In 1983, Israel and Lebanon signed a tripartite agreement intended to formalize a withdrawal and stabilize the border. It collapsed. What followed wasn't peace, it was a vacuum. Israeli forces eventually withdrew anyway, but without a strong Lebanese state to fill the space they left behind. Hezbollah filled it, instead emerging over the following 2 decades as the dominant security actor in the south. Analysts studying today's negotiations keep returning to this precedent, and not as a footnote, as a warning. A framework that removes Israeli forces without truly replacing them with Lebanese state authority has failed this exact way before. By the 2000s, Hezbollah was no longer a militia in any conventional sense. It had grown into the most heavily armed non-state actor in the Middle East, fielding more rockets, more trained fighters, and arguably more disciplined command structure than Lebanon's own national army. The 2006 war with Israel ended with UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which explicitly called for Hezbollah's disarmament and the extension of Lebanese state authority across the south. That was nearly 20 years ago. The resolution was never enforced. Hezbollah didn't shrink, it rebuilt, rearmed, and expanded. That pattern repeated again more recently. When Hezbollah entered the war alongside Gaza in October 2023, it was already operating from a position of strength built over years of non-enforcement. A ceasefire in 2024 was supposed to quiet the border. Instead, Hezbollah used the pause to restock its arsenal and rebuild damaged infrastructure, a violation Israel has cited repeatedly to justify the scale of its 2026 campaign. In Israel's framing, this wasn't a new decision to escalate. It was the conclusion of an argument that had been building for years. Negotiated restraint doesn't work on Hezbollah because Hezbollah has never actually complied with it. That is the pattern running underneath every one of these episodes: 1983, 2006, 2024. Each time a political or diplomatic arrangement asked Hezbollah to disarm or asked Lebanon to enforce disarmament on its own, and each time the group emerged stronger rather than weaker. History has run this experiment before, and it ended with Hezbollah more powerful, not less. That's the shadow hanging over every negotiation happening today. With that history in mind, the current disarmament push starts to look less like a technical security arrangement and more like a high-stakes attempt to rewrite 4 decades of failed precedent, which is exactly why the motivations behind it run far deeper than they first appear. On the surface, this looks like a dispute about weapons and withdrawal timelines. Underneath it is something far more consequential, a negotiation over what each major power can afford to lose, conducted through the language of Lebanese sovereignty. To understand where this goes, you have to look past the statements and into the calculations behind them. Start with Iran. For Tehran, Hezbollah was never simply an ally among several regional partners. It is Iran's most capable instrument of power projection into the eastern Mediterranean, and more importantly, its primary deterrent against direct strikes on Iranian territory. That deterrent value was tested and found wanting in February, when Israel and the United States reached directly into Iran and killed its supreme leader. Hezbollah's rocket and drone response afterward wasn't just retaliation. It was proof to Tehran's own leadership that the deterrent still functioned at all. Losing Hezbollah's arsenal now would not simply weaken a foreign partner. Analysts increasingly describe it as something closer to an existential risk for the regime itself, the loss of its last credible check on direct attack. That is why Iran fought to have Lebanon written explicitly into its own ceasefire memorandum with the United States, despite the fact that neither Hezbollah nor Iran is formally bound by the terms of Israel's separate arrangements in Lebanon. It was an attempt to protect an ally by treaty, using leverage that technically has no legal reach over the party actually doing the fighting. Israel's position looks equally uncompromising, but for a different reason. After a direct war with Iran and the killing of its supreme leader, Israeli military and political leadership has shifted to what might be called a never-again-wait doctrine toward Hezbollah, a refusal to repeat 2024, when a ceasefire gave the group cover to quietly rebuild the very arsenal it was supposed to surrender. But there is a second layer beneath the security logic, and it is domestic. With Israeli elections expected around October, Prime Minister Netanyahu faces a political reality in which any visible retreat from Lebanon, especially one that looks like it was forced by Washington, could be read at home as capitulation not to Hezbollah but to Trump. For a leader whose political identity is built on decisive security action, that perception would be costly. This is why Israel can simultaneously negotiate the trilateral framework with Lebanon's government, while publicly insisting that no broader ceasefire memorandum constrains its operations there. Both positions serve the same goal: engagement without the appearance of retreat. Washington's role is the most difficult to hold together because it is trying to satisfy two commitments that are not fully compatible. The United States needs the Iran memorandum to hold both, to prevent a slide back into open war and to bank a genuine diplomatic achievement. But it cannot compel Israel, its closest regional partner, to withdraw from Lebanon without risking the appearance of abandoning Israeli security at a moment of real vulnerability. The trilateral framework is Washington's attempt to resolve that contradiction without ever naming it. By placing the disarmament process in the hands of the Lebanese armed forces rather than Israel or the United States directly, the framework allows Israeli forces to draw down gradually under a process that looks like Lebanese state building rather than American pressure on Israel, while handing the political credit for progress to Beirut, not to Tehran. And that leaves Lebanon holding the most difficult position of all. President Aoun's government genuinely wants what it says it wants: an end to being the ground on which other countries settle their conflicts and a state capable of enforcing its own authority. But achieving that requires disarming a movement that still holds substantial political weight inside Lebanon's own institutions, while Israeli forces remain on Lebanese soil, and Hezbollah's base treats the entire framework as surrender dressed up as sovereignty. The public narrative describes this as Lebanon reclaiming control of its own territory. The strategic reality is closer to this. Lebanon has become the mechanism through which Israel and the United States settle a disagreement over enforcement that neither wants to have directly with the other or with Iran. This is where everything changes. Lebanon isn't simply the problem being solved here. It is functioning as the shock absorber, preventing three other far more dangerous conflicts from colliding directly. Iran avoids confronting Israel head-on by channeling its concern through diplomatic language in the MOU. Israel avoids confronting Washington directly by acting unilaterally in Lebanon, while still nominally cooperating with the framework. And the United States avoids choosing between its ally and its diplomatic achievement by outsourcing the resolution to Beirut. Once you see Lebanon as the pressure valve for these competing interests, it becomes clear why the outcome here won't stay contained. It will ripple outward, and it will reset the strategic map of the entire region. If Lebanon is the pressure valve holding three larger conflicts apart, then what happens inside that valve matters far beyond its borders. Two outcomes are possible here, and they point in almost opposite directions for the region. If the trilateral framework actually succeeds, if the Lebanese armed forces genuinely disarm Hezbollah zone by zone and Israeli forces withdraw in step, it would mark something Lebanon hasn't achieved since before the 1980s, a state with a real monopoly on the use of force within its own territory. That would not stay a local achievement. Gulf monarchies watching Iran-backed militias operate semi-independently in Iraq and Yemen would study this model closely, because it would be the first credible proof that a fractured state can reclaim authority from an entrenched armed movement through negotiation rather than open-ended war. But if it fails, the alternative isn't neutral, it's a return to 1983. Israeli forces draw down without genuine disarmament, Hezbollah reconsolidates in the vacuum left behind, quietly rebuilds, and the region isn't looking at decades of uneasy peace before the next war. It's looking at years. The economic stakes reinforce this urgency. As long as the situation stays unresolved, reconstruction funding stays frozen, more than 1 million displaced Lebanese cannot safely return home, and shipping and energy routes across the Mediterranean and the Gulf, already shaken once by closures of the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran war, remain exposed to renewed disruption. Instability in southern Lebanon doesn't stay contained to southern Lebanon. It touches insurance rates on tankers, investor confidence in Beirut, and fuel markets well beyond the region. The diplomatic stakes are higher still. If the Lebanon peace collapses, it doesn't just derail one framework, it threatens to unravel the broader US-Iran Memorandum that ended direct war between the two countries only months ago. That is the scenario every mediator in this process is quietly trying to avoid. Not just renewed fighting in Lebanon, but a slide back toward the kind of direct confrontation the region only narrowly escaped in early 2026. So who actually benefits, depending on how this unfolds? Iran gains from any outcome it can credibly present. As proof, the MOU protected Hezbollah's survival. Even a messy, incomplete disarmament process serves that narrative as long as Hezbollah still exists as a fighting force when the dust settles. Israel gains from any outcome that visibly removes the threat on its northern border without the cost and exposure of an indefinite occupation. Lebanon stands to gain the most of all genuine credit for restoring its own sovereignty, but it also stands to lose the most, because if the framework collapses, Beirut risks being blamed by both Israel and Hezbollah supporters simultaneously, with no side willing to own the failure. That's why this isn't only a story being watched in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran. Gulf states, along with mediators like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, all have a direct stake in this holding together, given how deeply they were already pulled into stabilizing the wider Iran war. What happens in the next few months in southern Lebanon won't just decide one country's future. It will decide whether the biggest Middle East peace deal in a generation survives, With so much riding on an arrangement this unstable, the critical question becomes, where does this actually go from here? Given everything holding this arrangement together, 4 paths forward stand out, and each one carries a different verdict for the region. The first is phased success. In this scenario, the pilot zone model expands steadily. The Lebanese armed forces demonstrate credible, verifiable disarmament. In the initial zones, Israel matches that progress with staged withdrawals, and Iran is able to claim without contradiction that the Lebanon Clause in its memorandum was honored not through open confrontation, but through a negotiated process it can point to as a win. This is the outcome American officials are visibly betting on. But it depends on 2 things that have not yet been proven: sustained restraint from an Israeli government facing real domestic pressure to look tough, and genuine cooperation from a Hezbollah that has so far rejected this framework outright. The second path is managed stalemate. Here neither full disarmament nor full withdrawal happens. Pilot zones stay limited, largely symbolic. Sporadic Israeli strikes continue. The situation settles into something resembling Israel's long, low-intensity presence in southern Lebanon before 2000, not open war, but not peace either. Periodic escalations repeatedly threaten to derail the broader Iran deal without ever fully breaking it. This is arguably the most likely near-term outcome, precisely because it requires the least amount of anyone actually backing down. The third path is collapse and renewed escalation. Hezbollah's rejection hardens rather than softens. Israeli strikes intensify, driven in part by Netanyahu's political calculations ahead of elections. And because Iran tied its own credibility to the Lebanon Clause of the MOU, Tehran comes under pressure to respond in some visible way, risking a slide back toward direct confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States. This is the scenario that echoes 1983 most closely, a negotiated framework, failing followed not by stability, but by a more entrenched and dangerous status quo. The fourth path is less obvious but worth watching closely: Lebanese political rupture. In this scenario, the framework doesn't fail because of Israeli strikes or Iranian pressure. It fails because Hezbollah's political weight inside Lebanon's own government makes full compliance practically impossible to deliver. That would trigger a domestic crisis over who actually controls the Lebanese state, independent of anything Israel or Iran does directly. Each of these paths carries real risk, renewed mass casualties, the unraveling of the US-Iran MOU, a wider regional war. But the first path, if it holds, carries something rare: a genuine template for state sovereignty reclaimed through negotiation, and a working model of US-Iran cooperation that could outlast this single crisis. For viewers tracking this story going forward, a few signals matter more than the headlines themselves. How quickly pilot zones actually expand, what Hezbollah's leadership says in the weeks ahead, how Netanyahu positions himself as Israeli elections approach, and whether Iran continues to invoke the Lebanon Clause publicly or lets it quietly fade from its rhetoric. Only one of these 4 paths ends with lasting peace. The other 3 all lead back to war. The question is simply how long the fuse is. Whichever path unfolds, one truth remains constant beneath all the shifting frameworks, ceasefires, and statements, and it's worth returning to where we started. Go back to where this started. 2 allies, 1 signed ceasefire. 2 completely different definitions of what it actually covers. That contradiction was never a communication failure, and it was never an accident of translation. It was the clearest possible signal of what this moment actually is. Lebanon's fate was never really about Lebanon. It became the language through which 3 far more powerful actors negotiate the limits of what they can demand from one another without triggering the confrontation none of them wants directly. Iran uses Lebanon to test how much protection its ceasefire with Washington actually buys its most important ally. Israel uses Lebanon to test how far it can act unilaterally while still remaining inside America's diplomatic framework. And the United States uses Lebanon to test whether it can hold an ally and an adversary in the same peace at the same time without ever being forced to choose publicly between them. That is why no external power can simply resolve this by imposing an outcome. Not Israel through continued military presence. Not Iran through pressure on Hezbollah to hold firm. Not even the United States through diplomatic architecture alone. The only outcome that produces something durable is one none of them can fully control from the outside. A Lebanese state strong enough to hold a genuine monopoly on the use of force within its own borders, sovereignty that is real, not simply declared. Whether that happens is still an open question, and it will be answered not in Washington or Tehran, but in whether Beirut can do something no external power has managed to do for it in over 40 years. So here's the question worth sitting with. If Lebanon becomes the first place in the modern Middle East where a state disarms an Iran-backed militia through negotiation rather than war, does that become the model the rest of the region eventually follows? Or is Lebanon once again simply the place where the next war is being delayed, not prevented?